Hey everyone, welcome to Dirk Island. This is the weekend show where we talk about documentaries we've been watching. This week we watched They Shall Not Grow Old. It's a World War I documentary by Peter Jackson, who did the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and he took a bunch of old World War I footage and digitally remastered it so you can really, it brings it to life so you can dive into it and kind of get a take on World War I that before I had never seen.
It was such a triumph of filmmaking, a really incredible achievement. So there's two things that they did in this which is really impressive, because we watched not only the film itself, but we watched kind of some behind the scenes of what they had to do to the old film to make it into the new film. And essentially what you're looking at with this They Shall Not Grow Old, the title is really communicating to you, you're looking at World War I. It's 100 years ago by now, 1917, 1918. And so everyone who was alive in the footage, you know, is dead. But they're all 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20, some guys a little bit older who look like they're a little bit higher up in the military. But for the most part, very young people who are all well past dead by now. A war that people really know very little about compared to like World War II or Vietnam or all the modern wars. But seeing the footage remastered in this way makes you connect to the people in a way that feels like more than a movie, because they are so young and they do all this stuff to the people's faces. Like it seems like there are basically three things they do. They colorize old black and white footage. It's really cool to see, and it's almost photoreal in a way. There's almost a painting-like quality to it. They also sharpen the face detail. It looks like they've basically gone in and remastered so that you can really see the blinking and the micro smiles and all this kind of stuff to the faces themselves, which really lets you see the people there. But what they did is, you don't realize that early footage, like from this era, 1917, 1918, had this different amount of frames. So what they did is they take the frames and they digitally added certain frames to make it come to life in a way that is the most remarkable achievement. They like add it so that the choppiness when you see old footage, when you kind of picture old footage, goes to this place where you see it morph into the right time frame. When the horse gallops, it's not a choppy gallop like from an old movie. It's slowed down to the point where it is real time and draws you in, and then they do artistic kind of blurs to give you this almost 3D effect, and then they add all of the sounds that you would expect, so horses, machines, gunfire. They had professional lip readers read people's mouths, so they have little people talking, sometimes full sentences, sometimes just, background laughing, and they add it in such a way that the film is so magically brought in 100 years into the future in a way that lets you see World War I, which is a really unique war because of the trench warfare reality that was that war that you hear about, that you could never see before. So that was, I think, just a real accomplishment in filmmaking, and that's a huge reason for why this is so engaging to watch.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I loved it. And I feel like they've created such a treasure for history. In a way, it's funny that they've doctored the footage. I mean, they've taken this historical footage as the way it was shot back in the day, and they've added all these things that really weren't picked up by the mic. There were no mics, it's silent footage. They add colorization and frames that weren't in the original footage, and even though in a sense they're doctoring it, it makes it so much more authentic feeling in a way. And there's something about old footage where they move quickly and janky, and there's no sound to it, that has made it difficult to emotionally connect to the realness. Whereas World War II, we've seen Saving Private Ryan, we've seen so much recreation of that, but also seen actual footage of it that helps you connect. Whereas with World War I, because of that, I didn't realize the emotional distance, that I just didn't feel for the intensity. I read about it, I learned about it in school, but it was striking how much it just automatically brings you in. And the way they do it is amazing, because the first 15 or so minutes of the film, you see a little frame with the way the footage was shot back in the day. It's got this jankiness to it. You have to see, we'll show it so you can see what it is, but it has this jankiness to it, and they do that for about 15 minutes up until the point where in the story we're entering the war itself, and they kind of do this flip where it goes from the old footage to the filling in the frames with the camera, the colorization, and then the sound, which is all fabricated based off what they did. But it was cool. Peter Jackson talks about how they took vocal lip reading experts to see what it was likely that the soldiers were saying, do voiceover, have the bombs, and it was interesting. I don't know enough about filmmaking to understand exactly what they're doing in some scenes, but some of the explosions, horses getting shot, and some of the close-ups of men's faces with their facial reaction, there's some flourishes where it's photoreal, and it's this moment that is like more than life, but it makes you able to connect to World War I in a way that I just hadn't before. It was just too distant in the future, and it's really cool. I like it. In parts you can tell, because they've digitally remastered, you can tell the original footage didn't have the detail that you'd want there, and it's almost as if an artist has gone and painted in the faces to add detail, and it looks like a moving painting in this, gives this effect that's very artistic and awesome.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it reminds me of the reason that I think this documentary matters. What you're talking about is this idea that the point where it goes from maybe the first 10 to 15 minutes of the old footage, so it really gets you comfortable with what 1917 Britain looks like. And just to be clear, a lot of this is from the British perspective, and a lot of the people who are narrating are British. I don't know if it's British maybe transcribed from before, but they've got a lot of British voiceover, and a lot of the soldiers you're seeing are British and German, because that's a lot of who was fighting in trench warfare in World War I. And so we see this, and you see this society that they're coming from in this almost gung-ho, like real funny, like, oh, we're off to war, the boys off to war in 1918, and we're off to, it's like a fun little adventure for boys. And then they give you the point where I remember seeing it because we had seen previews and been really interested to watch this, and seen where they slow down the footage first in black and white, where they're digitally adding the frames, and you can see someone walking around and they're like a little robot kind of walking, like when you see old footage, and then suddenly they slow down and you realize the person's walking at normal speed, and it just automatically feels somewhat real, and then they color it in, and it's really the reverse of Alice in Wonderland, right? Where they open into, or is it not Alice in Wonderland? It's The Wizard of Oz. It's reverse Wizard of Oz, right? Alice in Wonderland has a similar feel in a way, but it's the reverse Wizard of Oz, where it goes from black and white to color, and that was such a revolution in filmmaking in a way, or at least it was very fun as a filmmaking device. And this documentary uses it in the same way, but I say it's reverse because although you're going from black and white to color and remastered, you get to see that happen in real time at a moment in the documentary, and it brings you in such a way that you were almost disconnected before. It also, I say reverse, because they play normal happy society as the black and white janky old footage, and then you're in the trenches. It's like a first shot of trenches, which is really defining of World War I, when you see it go into the color. And so at the moment that it gets gruesome, warlike and gruesome, is the moment that it becomes more real. And it's really interesting because they do the reverse when the war is over. They go back into the black and white, and society can't really connect to the soldiers. It's another kind of point they talk about, where these soldiers come back and they didn't really have the respect that soldiers are there's a big push to give soldiers a lot of respect and thank them for service and all that happens in modern society. That was not the case 100 years ago, and people did not know what war was like, and it's almost like you as the viewer get that experience to see the reality and then go back to the little quaint society. And that's why it's the reverse Alice or Wizard of Oz, where the world that you see in color and you see remastered is the reality of World War I trench warfare, like you have never, I'm pretty sure, and no one has ever really seen in that way, who lives today, essentially. So it's a really an incredible thing to have made for that purpose.
Yeah, it feels, I do feel like it's like a time machine. You feel like all of a sudden it's like zoom right in, and you feel like you're there in a way that you just can't connect to the footage before. It does feel like a magical time machine that he's invented in the way you are able to jump back into what it must have felt like to be in those trenches. And it made me want to learn more about World War I. Quite honestly, embarrassing enough to admit, I feel like I know a decent amount about World War II. World War I feels very significant, and I had to Wikipedia. It made me start to care about it more, and I had remembered some of the details of the horrific nature of trench warfare, of using gas, of gas on people, of machine guns, and how brutal the war was, but I didn't remember really what it was about. And when I look, the assassination of the Austrian Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, I remembered that, then was like, what was the story though? So a guy gets assassinated, an Austrian gets assassinated by a Bolivian, and what does that have to do with Germans and British people fighting? So you look into it, and it's actually pretty interesting how convoluted it was. A proxy war of sorts, and a system of alliances starts getting Russia involved on the German side.
So yeah, explain it for as quickly as possible.
Yeah, sure. I can try to dive into my quick Wikipedia learnings where, an Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated by a Bolivian revolutionary, and through that, the Austrians basically threaten war, and the Bolivians make a response. It's not satisfactory, so we're going to war. The Bolivians have the Russians backing them, so Russia enters the fight against Austria, and Austria threatens Russia, says, you better step out of the conflict. Russia says, no, we're not going to do that. So then, the Germans who pair up with the Austrians declare war. So you've basically got the Germans and the Russians have jumped in by proxy, and now they're fighting. So then through that, France, who has connections to Russia, is joining the fight. So now Germany is like, okay, we're going to fight a war on both sides. We're versus Russia on one side, we're versus France on the other. They come up with a strategy. We're going to defeat France in 4 weeks. To do that, we need to go through Belgium. So we ask Belgium, can we go through your country to attack France? They're like, no, you can't do that. So they declare war on Belgium and France at the same time and try to enter. And through a pact Britain and Belgium have, Britain's like, okay, we're in this war too. And so you've got this German-British war that are now fighting, and those are the main fighters we know about.
Which is the defining war.
That's the only people I knew who I could really recall were in the war at all. And it's funny how both of them are like tangentially related to the initial conflict. That is the reason, if you look it up, it's like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is why World War I started. And you're like, okay, that explains nothing why somewhere in Belgium on the Western Front, Germany and Britain are fighting each other.
And then at the end, the U.S., because of allies with some of those countries, comes in and cleans it up a bit at the end. And you're kind of, that is so interesting to think about that, because you made the reference to, it's like as if the two Koreas fight a war and suddenly we're in a thing, which did happen, obviously, the Korean War. But it's just where you realize there could be some random ass proxy war that because this country has this thing, and then they're like, okay, this strategy requires us to go through this country, and they've got an alliance with someone else. It's like, oh shit, it's a war that's a lesson of why you got to be really careful about all this stuff getting out of hand very quickly. And so you hear about things like the US killing a bunch of Russian soldiers in Syria or something, and you're like, that's fucking awkward. And thankfully the US and Syria and Russia are like not really going to go out in public and be like, well, fuck you for they're kind of, both of them kind of keep it under wraps. But like in modern days when this happens, and because you realize, like, if people get too gung-ho on their random people they're backing, you've got World War III pretty not so different than you had World War I.
Which is such a frightening thought, because most people are primed with World War II that there's this feeling that we were fighting for, it was an existential threat to the entire globe, an imperialist threat that wanted to take over. There's like Man in the High Castle, this show that depicts like what the world would be like if we lost World War II, and the United States is completely colonized by Japan and Germany. There's this feeling that, and there was the Holocaust, obviously, there was feeling that it was a war worth fighting. World War I was equally just totally brutal to the soldiers that were in it. Death by gas. Tanks were invented for the first time. The machine gun that could just tear through people in a way that the world hadn't seen, and really brutal, gritty trench warfare. And it's over not an existential threat to the entire world, but a proxy war and a series of alliances that gets us into something. And the movie, I like how in the end, after we're kind of done with the war, it reverts back to the old footage, and you kind of referred to how society looked at the war, and it has some dialogue that's being read of people who were in World War I really questioning, why is war worth it? And especially for a reason like that, it's impactful. And, it's just harder to connect to World War I because it's further in the distance and the footage is not there. But it cannot be overstated how the digitally remastering just makes you care more. If you could, I feel like I got the sense watching this, like, this should be in classrooms. Like, this should be shown in schools. Museums should make sure it's locked in a vault for everywhere, like, for posterity's sake. I feel like Peter Jackson's kind of done us a service by creating, like, this awesome nugget of history that's now luckily enshrined in a way that will be accessible to future generations.
Yes. Yeah, it really is. That is the... it's the title, right? They shall not grow old, and the accomplishment. They really did they did accomplish that, bringing World War I in 100 years into the future, because it does teach you an important lesson, and a different lesson than we're often focused on. We are often focused on the existential threat type of everything. The existential threat of the Nazis, of Imperial Japan, people who believe they are of a superior race or a superior ideology, the existential threat of a worldwide caliphate, as in ISIS's goal. Everyone needs to live under our version of what's theocracy. Mm-hmm. The worldwide threat of Soviet Russia. Everyone, for communism to truly work right, everyone needs to be a communist country so that we can all have worldwide communism. And even from a different perspective, the idea that everyone needs to be an American version of a democracy, what a lot of we were thinking we were doing in Iraq. Now, not to say that I don't want to say any of those are equivalent. Obviously, I don't think that. But the idea that we always think that every ideology that's dangerous is the one that wants to conquer the entire world. That is one version of a dangerous idea. That is one version of an idea that everyone needs to think like me. Even if it's, let's say, for climate change, right? The only way we can accomplish climate change is if everyone agrees and everyone's on the same page. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily think that's a dangerous idea, but a lot of ideas we think are only really important if they are these worldwide, everyone needs to get on the same page. Anyone who's not on the same page needs to be a problem. And then even the idea that everyone should be free to think their own thing is a bit of a worldwide idea, because that's like, if only everyone could just be free to do what they want, then the world would be a better place. It's funny how every idea somehow comes to this larger than, has to go the whole world for it to really work. But those are the ideas we normally play with, whereas World War I, the reason that's important is because of this random ass freaking domino effect. And the thing that we see that's so surprising in some of these trenches when they're talking is how when the British and the Germans meet each other when like one becomes a prisoner, they're like, these guys are kind of nice. Like, and like a lot of people who are like, they're like, some of them, they were like snipers, but they were the type of snipers that like missed every time. You know what I mean? And it's like these people who basically they were shooting, but they like weren't trying to kill anyone. They were just like there because their country told them to. And by the end, and by when they meet someone, they're like, I don't even know, like, we don't even know why we're fighting each other. And then they talk about what was another interesting element that we kind of paused and kind of went through and looked up, but this whole the inter-animosity between the different German states of the time, Bavaria versus, what was it, the Bavarians
Prussia
versus the Prussians, and then a bit with like the Saxons or something.
Yeah.
And it's like all these groups that you haven't even heard of because 100 years ago, I mean, unless if you know German history, obviously it's different, but for most people don't even have any concept of what these types of groups are. And talking about how the Bavarians, like the English, like the Bavarians are actually really great. Like they're really great. It's the Prussians who are like the shitty ones. And the Prussians are basically like Berlin and to the east, and the Bavarians are like Munich and south. So different parts of Germany, if you're familiar with them. And then one time they said they were basically on two ends of a trench, in Belgium, these things. And somehow they found out that the Saxons who were on the German side fighting were going to get relieved by a bunch of Prussians. And they were like, suck it to the Prussians. Like, we hate those guys. like some sort of weird communication where you're realizing that people are in these wars, especially this World War I is so important because it's like a bunch of people who got into this war and they're like, I don't know why I'm doing this. Like, and I could hate my own enemy. I could hate my own teammate as much. Like, it's just a really fascinating war to think about because it's so not our normal paradigm. And if you're really trying to understand where like the black swan could come about, the black swan is the idea that, the market crashed because of the mortgages. We thought real estate would always go up, but then until it didn't. Just because you haven't seen a black swan doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right?
Oh, okay, that's the idea.
Yeah, that's the black swan in the simplest form, right? Just because you haven't seen a black swan, just because you've seen something only white swans forever doesn't mean a black swan can exist. And so that the idea of a black swan event is the idea that people can they can see something over and over again. They can always think that the threat's going to come from here, here, here. But the more you know about history, the more that things that people would be like, how was I supposed to know that a black swan existed? It's like, well, if you do know that a war can fall out like a World War I, and you do see these interactions that we are privy to see because this movie exists, it really does give you an extra file to put into your mental category, which is like, no, not the only threat that exists is worldwide fascism. Not the only threat that exists is worldwide communism. Not the only threat that exists is worldwide imperialism or colonialism. Or whatever else it could be. Whatever else people think. The other threats that exist are random escalations based on no one backing down or realizing that dominoes fall in a certain way. And that saying it in that way is like, everyone knows that dominoes can fall, but really it's a different paradigm that is revealed through this, which is really awesome to kind of add to your knowledge base of history for people, really, because there's no one you've ever talked to about World War I, who lived it, at least for me.
Yeah, I'm obviously not a history buff, but it says something that I was struggling to describe what World War I is about. And I imagine I'm not the only person who's like that. And it kind of lends itself to, was the war worth it? And it very much feels like it wasn't, in a way. And it's striking. You bring up one of the most important parts of it. When the Americans break through the trenches, the front lines of the Germans, and they do a raid and take a bunch of prisoners, they're weirdly friendly with each other in a way that is not relatable, and I don't feel like it was in World War II. I mean, I'm thinking of Saving Private Ryan, which is my kind of reference point, where there is a specific scene, they describe in They Shall Not Grow Old, there's surrendering Germans in the middle of a super bloody battle, and they take prisoners. They don't just shoot them. In the D-Day scene in Saving Private Ryan, there is a moment where they're like, Germans are putting their hands up and they're like, oh, what are you saying? What are you saying? And then they just shoot them both. And they're like, there's kind of this dirty kraut, ideology. Same thing with, the Middle East. There's such hatred and ideology building on both sides. In the US, we're like, they hate us. They hate our freedom. They hate our way of life. They would.
They want to oppress everyone. If they had control, everyone would be a slave to some sort of theocratic whatever. You convince you, whether true or not. It's very helpful for war purposes to make people convince each other that the enemy is their worldview is just unacceptable.
Yeah.
If they had any control over anything, it would just be you would rather off yourself. And it's not a world you'd live in.
Absolutely. You feel like you're fighting for the soul of the world. There's this idea that they would not surrender to you because they would rather kill you and just martyr themselves. Same thing in World War II. I mean, I'm talking about the relationship with the Germans. We also are so much more well-versed with kamikaze culture in Japanese, where they're not giving up. They don't care if they die. They're going to do whatever it takes to kill you. Yes. So you're right. You draw such a different lesson about war, learning a little bit more about World War I, where you can genuinely tell the British and the Germans did not hate each other. They felt like they were both kind of trapped in the uniform, so to speak, in a way that you just aren't as exposed to being a person of our age in the United States, learning a lot more just about different wars.
Yeah, and I mean, I was telling you just before we watched this about watching Dr. Zhivago, which is basically a movie. It's like a Gone with the Wind type movie. If you haven't seen it, it's like an epic movie about kind of the Russian Revolution in that era. But the Russian Revolution was happening and happened in the wake of World War I. And there's a scene where a lot of Russians are going to the front line of the Russian version of this, front, which they're fighting, I guess, the Germans also in this war. And a lot of them are going, don't fight for what do they even call them in Russia at the time? The Tsar? Is that what they had?
Oh,
yeah, I'm like,
I've already said I'm
like,
not the history.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, don't do it. What are you fighting for? Fight for your own freedom. And in the wake of this type of society where a ton of people are fighting for, like, who's this random person I'm fighting for? What am I fighting for? Some like random alliance? I mean, think about the thing we said so ridiculous is like, think about what we were fighting for in World War I. Eventually, if you just like did it back, like we weren't even on the side of the guy who got assassinated, Franz Ferdinand, technically, right? We were on the other side, like technically backing up like the people who didn't want to do more to apologize for it. I mean, not that it's such a more complicated
I'm sure there's so much backstory. But yeah, it's like, you're like, I don't even know. Like, it's so hard to even explain, except for the fact that, like, my friend was punched. I was, like, gonna go fight for him, not, like, my non-friend. It's like, and so we get to that, and then you see what that led to so much in the world, the catalyst of the everything that happened out of World War I, II is another set of lessons, which is more discussed, but how, Germany, by being so defeated in such a way, then it just gave rise to an even worse problem in Germany with the rise of the Nazis. But also in Russia, the fact that a lot of people were very convinced by the idea that, what are we fighting for in the society? We don't have control over this society. And the vulnerability that you put your society, if you're really thinking about what a World War I is going to do to your society, when you have wars where there's a potential for people to escalate into a war, that they really don't have any beef with the citizens of the other side. It allows the citizens to be like, fuck the government, let's wreck the whole fucking house over this. And so you have the Russian Revolution. That's another simplistic version, but it's looking at all this stuff and trying to extrapolate certain themes about it. What is it to see a war where the two sides don't really know why they're fighting it? What is it to see a war where people aren't even really having the fun time they thought they'd have in war, like going out and having an adventure, and instead they're sitting in a fucking puddle of mud in Belgium, where if they pop their head up, it's going to
just get mowed down by this machine gun, which is totally impenetrable without the tanks and the air supplies that happen by the time World War II comes around. And so it's this complete stalemate situation. Then you're talking about just random gassings and artillery shells smashing you anyway and killing you. And you're just sitting there shaking and hoping that you don't get gassed, pop your head up and get sniped or machine gunned, or it's a totally different war, just a completely ridiculous, horrible war. And you're sitting there fighting lice and fighting trench foot, and it's just like, it's really great to get into this reality. I mean, I feel like seeing this is going to be, in a good way, like just in the brain for forever. Yeah, it's the point of reference now.
It really feels like the end of Innocence, and I like the way it's portrayed in the film, where you can tell this is maybe one of the last generations of gung-ho young lads who are ready to go off to war, and they still have this kind of antiquated view of a glorious sense to war. And as it turns into the reality of trench warfare and technology, new technology has come up, including the machine gun and gas and tanks, that you see the turn from it feels like the last generation of people who thought of the glories of war, and turns into kind of what are more modern, knowing how brutal and, avoid at all costs, I feel, is how most people feel in the United States now. And, back then you kind of feel the turning of the end of Innocence.
Yeah, I agree. Hey everyone, welcome back to Dirk Island. This segment is worth watching, and we're talking about They Shall Not Grow Old, the documentary by Peter Jackson, the director of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's about remastered World War I footage, and it is incredible. I just want to say right off the bat, we actually have a consensus on this. It is a 9. Definitely worth watching. Now, we just finished this, paid for it on Apple iTunes. I was actually waiting for this. We've had this in the calendar of when is this going to release for rental. Just watched it, had heard about it, had watched a lot of the background footage of how they did it, adding frames, adding colorization, really giving you a picture of the faces. But what the real triumph is this making you see for the first time ever what people who, every single one of them that you're witnessing, this is 1917, 1918, World War I, you've never seen before or never talked to probably in your lifetime someone who experienced the trenches of World War I, and it takes you in, and it takes you in with the random smiling and goofing off, and also the random bloodshed that happens in a trench warfare where people are popping their heads off and getting them blown up because a machine gun is just so much more powerful than anything they're really able to do, except for throwing a bunch of people over the edge of the trench with covered by a bunch of artillery fire, and a lot of them getting mowed down. And just takes you in there in a way that has never been seen before. And that, for me, is why I think it's a 9. And a 9 for us, just to explain the scale, is it means that even if you don't like documentaries, this documentary, I think, will add to your view of the world. And for me, it definitely has done that. It's like I did not have the understanding of World War I until I saw this movie. And I think it's a true service to the film, the history of film in a way, because it does take some film that just you weren't able to connect to in the same way, and the remastering does do something. It creates a new good that perhaps for another 100 years people will be able to connect back to the reality that was World War I, and why that is different from World War II and Vietnam and all the subsequent wars, and to add that really gem of knowledge and to personalize it, to let you see 20-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds that you could never really see and connect to before when looking at the old janky footage, like old 1918, 1919 footage looks like. When they remaster it, it creates it new, personalizes it, and unlocks a whole new story of knowledge that you can't have really without seeing it.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest. This was Michael's idea to watch it. He put it on the calendar. He's like, we got to watch this. They Shall Not Grow Old. And I wasn't quite sure why you had come up with it. I go, watching old footage, sure it's remastered. Didn't quite get it. Put it on, you see what the digital remastering does. It allows you to access World War I in a way I just hadn't before. And I didn't, World War I's one of the most significant occurrences in the last, couple hundred years, and I didn't know that much about it. So I can't guarantee that everyone who's not a history buff is going to love this, but this is your dose of spinach. Like, you should definitely, you owe it to yourself. It's, an hour and a half or so, 2 hours that gives you access to World War I like you never had, and made me interested enough to look up more about World War I. It's just totally worth it. I think it's just like a spoon. It's a dose of spinach that you owe to yourself to get access to a really significant world event that I feel, despite, being one of the two world wars, people know almost so little about in comparison to World War II, partly because it was a lot, it was 1914 to 18. It's far back, it's less accessible, and Peter Jackson just takes this footage that really would be difficult to watch for an hour and a half in its original state. It's janky, it's black and white, it doesn't have sound, it's hard to connect emotionally to the realities of trench warfare when you see these little people janking around like most old school footage. And the way he digitally remastered, which is kind of beyond my filmmaking knowledge to know how they did it. It looks super cool, and it brings you into it in a visceral, emotionally engaging way that is totally worth kind of going out of your way to check out.
Yes, for sure. And even if this is not, we didn't give it a 10. Even if this is not necessarily one of the greatest documentaries of all time, which is what we'd reserve a 10 for, it may very well be the best movie of this year. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, because of the filmmaking accomplishment. It's not the most, incredible story like maybe you've seen Free Solo or Icarus that have won the Oscar for documentary in the last 2 years, and it's definitely doesn't have the play of even like a Theranos documentary or a Leaving Neverland where it's really super controversial and everyone wants to watch it. But in cinema history, this movie I feel like is going to have a place, and we just saw it today. It is a true accomplishment. It does remind you, as we were saying, of Jane is another accomplishment of making that, colorizing it in a way that really brings it to life. But I think this really is the greatest example I've ever seen of that, and that's why I would say it's definitely worth watching.
Yeah, I feel like it sounds overstated. I feel like Peter Jackson has done the world a favor by putting in the painstaking effort to make it. Because it really,
the team.
Yeah, and the team it probably took a team of countless hours to make this film look as good as it does. But I feel like they've done like a social good by bringing back this section of history in such a visceral and impactful way.
Yes. Okay. Thanks very much for watching us. If you want to keep up with us, please subscribe here on YouTube, and you can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts to listen to the podcast version. Thanks very much.
Thank you.